Hypocrisy. If you're a scholar and you're going to be going after mythicism, this is one thing you do not want to do. Yet, the field of historical Jesus studies is rife with hypocrisy. The Kipp Davis and Dapper Dino live stream had at least 5 instances of hypocrisy in it. If you want to fuck around and find out what these 5 instances are, then please stay tuned. What's up, heathens? How y'all doing? I'm the Godless Engineer, and I critically analyze apologist claims to give you the best arguments and information so that you can stand up and use your voice. Today, we're going to be discussing some issues that I had during the Dr. Kipp Davis and Dapper Dinosaur live stream. As you all know, I had Dr. Carrier on to discuss some of the points that were raised in that live stream. During the interview, I did mention one particular bit of hypocrisy that both Dr. Kipp Davis and Dapper Dinosaur engaged in. First, they suggested that Dr. Carrier wasn't either credentialed enough or credentialed at all to discuss topics of the historical Jesus or early Christianity in general. Dapper Dinosaur even went as far as to say that Dr. Carrier's work in this area wasn't even scholarly. While Kipp maintained that Dr. Carrier does have credentials, it's just that Dr. Kipp seems to question how well trained Dr. Carrier is in the areas of early Christianity. Here, I'll let them tell you themselves.
Let's take a look at what are the arguments that are used by mythicists, including, I think the primary driver of mythicism is unarguably Richard Carrier, right? Like, I don't think he's the only person who's even, as far as I can tell, like close to credentialed, who makes it his mission to push for Jesus mythicism. What are some of the arguments that you hear both in, well, I don't know if I want to say scholarly circles, given that I don't know that I would say that Richard Carrier's work on this counts as scholarly, but in professional circles, shall we say?
I'll just make a point here that while Richard Carrier is a credentialed historian, an ancient historian, problematically, importantly, he has no training at all in early Judaism, early Jewish literature. He can't read the texts in their original languages. And I would even go so far as to say that I have serious questions about how much professional training he actually has in like Christian origins and in the New Testament.
But also during this live stream, they seem to support and promote obviously uncredentialed individuals that were in opposition to Dr. Carrier's work and thus were validating their preconceived notions about whatever topic they were writing on. This just so happens to include a magical version of Jesus's historicity. That particular scholar or expert was trying to subvert the mainstream historical consensus about Jesus and present his own magical version as being historical. Again, I'll just let them tell you themselves.
Daniel N. Gada, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, for $20 said, simply put, it makes the best sense of the data, sources, and rise of ancient Christianity. Scholars disagree on the how, but we all basically agree that the historical Jesus is a part of the how Christianity got going.
Thanks very much, Daniel. So for those of you who don't know, Daniel Gada is actually a recent PhD graduate from the University of Stanford, I believe, and he's a scholar of the period. He actually wrote a solid review of on the historicity of Jesus that he had published in the Journal for the Study of the Historical Jesus. Please let me know if I got all that right, Daniel. Oh, yep, he says correct.
I may have been in a position to be receiving articles for a journal and received a piece from him and was thoroughly unimpressed about the quality of that piece, including the basic writing of it, spelling, things like that. Gada mischaracterizes Carrier's form of mythicism, claiming that it involves the notion that Jesus's body was manufactured from a cosmic sperm bank, right? So Carrier's actually explained this really well for something that sounds so far out, so ridiculous. He's explained it really well on the page immediately before the one Galata cites. So if Galata's read the book, he actually has read that page, right before it. And Carrier's even saying that, there's the allegorical interpretation as well. But of course, critics are not going to look at that, even when you say that's my favorite interpretation, the allegorical reading of this cosmic sperm bank, and not the literal look at there was a cosmic sperm bank, which still works in this sort of worldview. I've shown it as well with Zoroastrianism. Zoroastrianism had things like that, where the lake that Zoroaster went into and jizzed into was basically a sperm bank, that a future maiden would come in and be impregnated with their Messiah. So even literally, Carrier showing even literally this would work. He's not saying that's the way we should go. Maybe we should just focus on the allegory, but they overlook that completely and just want to say, look at these people and their stupid views, cosmic sperm banks, sky demons, what crazy things they believe. So he overlooked all that, very, very dishonest. And once again, this got published. And you think, well, how can this get published? It's such poor quality. So like Pedersen, Galata also bewails Carrier's mathematical approach, though he offers up no alternative, transparent and workable method. So, I mean, that's a huge problem right there. It's complaining that work was done really well and doesn't actually show, that he doesn't like the method, but he had nothing to replace it with.
Awesome. Thanks.
While you're getting that ready, though, real quick, Daniel and Galota, how do you say it, Dr. Kipp Davis?
I don't. I honestly, I've not met Daniel. I've only spoken to him online.
Okay. Well, he says for $10 on this subject would recommend Simon Gathercole, The Historical and Human Existence of Jesus in Paul's Letters in the Journal for the Study of Historical Jesus, 16, 2-3, 2018, 183 through 212.
Simon Gathercole, in his explanation of the objectives of his survey, presents a version of Jesus that encompasses magical elements. This interpretation challenges not only the mythicist perspective, but also the minimalist historical view of Jesus, which is commonly accepted among many secular individuals. It's puzzling why an atheist would view this paper as representative of their stance, given its endorsement of supernatural aspects.
And that brings me to another point here, which are these source issues. Carrier in his book spends a lot of time mining basically the rabbinic literature, the Talmud, mostly the Babylonian Talmud, but also like the Mishnah, the Mishnah and the Talmud Yerushalmi, or the Jerusalem Talmud. And at this point, I mean, there's enormous problems with the way that he reads these texts. And at this point, I'll just direct you to a friend of mine who I do see in the chat. Simone is a graduate student in rabbinic literature, and she runs a blog called help me out, Simone, if you can pop it in the chat there. Is it?
Simone's critique of Carrier's work mirrors Dr. Kipp's approach, primarily targeting Carrier's perceived deficiencies in source text and analysis. However, this criticism overlooks a key aspect. Carrier actually summarizes existing scholarship on these points. Additionally, Simone's claim that Carrier fails to cite secondary sources is contradicted by their own acknowledgement of at least one secondary source cited by Carrier while disregarding his other citations. This selective approach raises questions about the effectiveness of their critique, particularly since they do not directly address the substance of Carrier's summarized arguments. Now, my point in all of this is not to say that you can't use uncredentialed amateurs or just non-credentialed graduate students in order to support your position. That's not my position at all. The problem that I have is that Dr. Kipp Davis and Dapper Dinosaur seem to have no problem supporting people that don't actually have credentials in this area or are supporting a very magical version of history, all because it aligns with their preconceived notions. This is a logical inconsistency that really bothers me, and I think that it should bother more people that a scholar of Dr. Kipp's caliber would engage in such blatant expressions of hypocrisy. What I came away with after watching that live stream a whole 2 times was that they don't care about being logically consistent in their argumentation against mythicism. It becomes incredibly obvious that they are just looking for positions that support their preconceived notions or support the narratives that they're wanting to push, and they just run with those regardless of what the argument actually is. And for a scholar like Dr. Kipp Davis, I would think that this would be embarrassing for him. But wait, there's more. Because I did not uncover just that single instance of hypocrisy in the live stream. I actually uncovered at least 4 more instances of their hypocrisy. Considering the amount of hypocrisy that appeared in this 2.5 hour live stream, I feel like this is building towards a behavioral trend. All right, so the first bit of hypocrisy that I want to cover is actually concerning the genetic fallacy, and really fallacies in general, I guess. In this particular instance, the fallacy is the genetic fallacy. Typically, we see the genetic fallacy whenever somebody is saying, oh, well, that particular idea is wrong because this group says it. But a genetic fallacy can also be committed if you are saying, oh, look, this group over here believes in this one particular thing, and this group hates this other group over here, so they will support this thing that is harmful to that other group, regardless of whether or not it's actually true. First, we're going to start off with Dr. Kipp Davis and Dapper Dino discussing anti-theism and its relation to mythicism.
So this is, but I think this is an important point to make here as well. That what we come to discover in this is that so much of the argumentation from those who promote themselves or who promote the idea of mythicism, and this is one of the reasons why it survives where it does, which seems to be on the internet by and large has barely made a dent, if at all, in actual academics. So this is one of the reasons. You will see people who promote this idea quite frequently start from a position of being very polemic against religion generally, against Christianity in particular, and I think this does have a tendency to feed into where this type of thinking comes from, and how seriously why many of these people do take this, who do take this seriously, the reason why they do.
I've noticed there's a certain group of people who seem to be willing to believe anything as long as that thing would be bad for Christianity if it were true. Which is not a great heuristic for actually getting to the facts of matters, Sometimes things that are good for Christianity, if they were true, turn out to be true. And sometimes things that would be bad for Christianity, if they were true, turn out to be true. And vice versa. Sometimes those things turn out to be false. Turns out that what would be good for believing Christians, if it were true, has no bearing on the likeliness of it being true for the most part. And also in just when dealing with people on the internet who have bought into the whole mythicist idea, because I know it's particularly popular on the internet, especially among anti-theist, atheist communities.
So this particular sentiment that is espoused throughout the live stream has a number of issues. So this particular sentiment about anti-theists and mythicism expressed throughout the video is a sweeping generalization of the anti-theist position. Being an anti-theist doesn't necessarily entail being a mythicist, but it seems to me like both Dr. Kipp Davis and Dapper Dinosaur seem to think that anti-theists will latch on to any idea as long as it's harmful to Christianity. And as you heard, Dapper Dinosaur thinks that this isn't a good heuristic because it's not. But also this is a form of the genetic fallacy. Just because they perceive anti-theists to grasp onto anything in order to argue against Christianity doesn't mean that that's actually what they're doing. It automatically assumes that anti-theists don't have rational reasons to have the position that they hold. And they don't actually define what they mean by anti-theist or anti-theism. mysticism. This is a problem because it allows the audience to sort of interpret in their own way what they mean by anti-theism. Most people think of anti-theism as being an asshole who wants to kill religion no matter what. But that's not what the anti-theist position is. Now, for me personally, I would characterize myself as an anti-theist because I feel like religion is a net negative on society, but that doesn't mean that I want to kill off religion or force people to not have a religion. I just wholly reject the idea of religion, and I think that it's bad for people in general. Another thing that they are doing in this clip is that they are totally disregarding any of the arguments for mythicism and focusing on the supposed motivation of the group that believes in it. Fabricating motivations and then solely focusing on the motivation rather than the claims that are made is just an easy way to dismiss the argument, and it's not a good heuristic for determining truth. Basically, Dr. Kipp Davis and Dapper Dinosaur are influencing their audience to be preconditioned to dismiss mythicism just because of this idea that only anti-theists are adhering to the position, or that the position is popular with anti-theists. They're basically setting the tone for their entire live stream right at the beginning of the video, and that tone is to reject mythicism regardless of the claims that mythicism makes. Instead, we're going to focus on the people that adhere to it, why they are wrong or bad or horrible or anything like that, and then we can dismiss it because they are bad and horrible people. Again, they are refusing to address the arguments right here at the beginning and are immediately disregarding mythicism just based on who is supporting or purporting to have this particular idea, which again is a sweeping generalization that is not true. More importantly on this point, genetic fallacies are actually rampant in this discussion. In my conversation with Dr. Bart Ehrman, he even committed a genetic fallacy when I brought up multiple scholars that disagreed with his position. He rejected one of the scholars that I brought up simply on the basis that he was a Christian, so automatically that makes him wrong or too biased to have a good opinion on the topic. But when I go out and I look at other scholars that are experts, also experts in this particular area, like Daniel Boyarin and Martin Hengel and scholars like that, they seem to have it pretty firmly and unequivocally stated that there was a pre-Christian suffering and dying Messiah concept in Judaism prior to the advent of Christianity. I'm kind of at, I guess, a difficult point here. There's more scholars than Boyarin and Hengel that assert this, but there are multiple scholars in this particular area that seem to argue from the primary text that there was a suffering and dying pre-Christian Messiah or pre-Christian idea of a Messiah. I guess that's kind of where I'm having a hard time with comparing both of these hypotheses.
Yeah, what I suggest you do is you look up the text that they refer to and see if they're talking about a suffering Messiah. I mean, this is what scholars do. You know, scholars disagree on everything, but there are very few scholars. Hengel was a very committed Christian who believed that Jesus fulfilled Scripture, and he was a committed conservative Christian. And conservative Christians do talk about suffering messiahs. They talk about Isaiah 53, for example, or Psalm 22. When you actually look at those passages, just read them yourself. You don't need to take my word for it. You'll see they're not talking about the Messiah. And so Hengel might say they're talking about the Messiah, but look at them yourself. Look and see if the term Messiah is used in there. Look to see what term is used in there. So it's always possible to take a very thin sliver of scholars who might say this, but that view's never really caught any traction among critical. I mean, I'm talking about 99% of the scholars who do this stuff think, yeah, no, not really.
Now, regardless of the motivation of that particular scholar, it should matter what arguments the scholar is making rather than what their particular position is in general. If the scholar is making a bad argument, sure, reject that bad argument, give us your reasons why it should be rejected, and if they're convincing enough, then people will agree with you. But that's not what Dr. Ehrman did. Dr. Ehrman just rejected the claim outright simply because the scholar was a Christian. And as most people know, Dr. Ehrman is a historicist, a staunch historicist. Now, I have seen some mythicists make this argument, and that's what Dapper Dinosaur and Dr. Kipp Davis are going to discuss here in a second. But I do want to say from the outset, do not do this as anybody, really, not just a mythicist, but anybody. Don't just reject somebody because they are a Christian or because they are an anti-theist. Have good reasons to reject an argument. Don't reject the argument simply because somebody else that you don't like made it. All right, so here's Dapper Dinosaur, and he's going to scold mythicists for doing that exact thing of disregarding scholars because they're Christian.
And what you'll often hear from mythicists is that, yes, but all of these guys were trained by people who are Christians and at institutions which are, overtly Christian. And
so
they're just
doubling down on the
sorry.
Yeah, they're just doubling down on the genetic fallacy. Where it's like, they were taught by a Christian, so ultimately it all just comes out of dogmatic Christianity. You got to get rid of all of it. Hey, pro tip to both the young Earth creationists and the mythicists out there: the genetic fallacy is called a genetic fallacy because it's fallacious. You shouldn't use it. Just going to put that out there.
Again, just to reiterate, do not do this. Just because a scholar is a Christian doesn't mean that they're automatically wrong. It just means that you have to be a little bit more skeptical about their conclusions depending on what topic you're talking about. As far as the historical Jesus goes, I feel like there's a solid enough reason to question the conclusions of some of the staunchest Christian scholars. And I feel like you should focus more on the argument being made rather than on their predilection to a magical sorcerer in the first century. Now, as far as the topic that's being discussed in this live stream, it is the only scholarly peer-reviewed version of the mythicist position that they are really discussing here because it's mainly the topic of Richard Carrier. It's the one that's brought up. They don't really try to go for the more amateurish people out there like Archaea S or anybody like that. They solely focus on the minimal mythicist position, which I do commend them for. That's what you should be talking about. It is the one position that has been reviewed multiple times and has passed peer review, so that should be the standard for the mythicist position. But as you'll notice, he chastises mythicists for doing the exact thing that they are doing in the video. They committed a genetic fallacy. They are poisoning the well against mythicists, but then it's perfectly fine for them to turn around and do that to mythicists. But this peer-reviewed position, the minimal mythicist position, uses Christian scholarship in order to make its point. Like on the topic of Tacitus. One of the best works out there that analyzes Tacitus and coming to a conclusion on Tacitus is Robert Van Voorst, who's a retired New Testament scholar who is also a Christian. So the position uses Christian scholarship in order to make the case for the position. And, it's perfectly normal in a position like this to present arguments as to why other people are wrong about their conclusions. And so this is just normal scholarly discourse at this point. Dapper Dinosaur and Dr. Kipp, they want to make it out to be like we're just disregarding them based on the fact that they're Christian. If that were the case, then we wouldn't be using Christian scholarship in order to make the argument for the position. Of course, none of this is really going to affect either Dr. Kipp, Dapper Dinosaur, or any other staunch historicist out there that seeks to misrepresent the position. They only care about poisoning the well against mythicism instead of actually tackling the arguments that are being made. Instead, they like to strawman the position. They make up different arguments and they muddle the arguments that mythicism makes. This is not the mark of a good scholar here, nor is it the mark of a rational mind to commit a fallacy so blatantly in this live stream. All right, so that's it for the first bit of hypocrisy there. We're going to be moving on to our second bit of hypocrisy, and that's concerning the gap in knowledge that we have about the earliest Christians.
One of the things that scholars are coming more and more to recognize is that Christianity, Christianity that emerged in the late first century into the second century, is Paul's version of Christianity. That, Paul could be considered the founder of Christianity as we know it, but then also there's still this Jewish movement behind there that, existed in Jerusalem. Mm-hmm. We know it was there. Paul himself talks about it. Unfortunately, we know very, very little about it. And that's one of the challenges here is attempting to uncover, what this Jesus movement looked like before Paul. I'll just say too, the reason why the Jesus movement before Paul didn't survive is because Jerusalem was sacked. The church in Jerusalem died when the city was destroyed, as many things died with the.
It's hard to keep that community together when you're kicked out of the city. Because one of the things you got to remember is that it wasn't just that the temple was destroyed; the Jews were kicked out. A new city was built on the location, more or less. And they weren't allowed back in except for once a year for the next more than 1,000 years. So
and this is the followers of Jesus weren't alone in this. I mean, for the most part, the Sadducites or the Sadducees, disappeared with the destruction of Jerusalem. The Essenes disappeared with the destruction of Jerusalem. So, of course, this early Jesus movement centered in Jerusalem disappeared with most of these other sects of Judaism. So I'll just say that I think the focus that mythicism has brought on this question has been a good thing.
Yes, I agree with everything that Dr. Kipp said here. I mean, there is a huge gap in our knowledge. We don't know anything about what was said about Jesus prior to Paul. And the Christianity that exists now is, in effect, Paul's Christianity, because that's the major influencer at the time. He is the one that influenced Christian theology, and that's the one that built the initial Catholic Church and built the orthodoxy and the theology of Christianity in general. And we know next to nothing about the earliest Christians, or for that matter, any other Christian groups that were really going around at the time. We only have fragments of what they said because later church fathers quoted them. The original texts were either destroyed or they were not sustained through transcription and scribal work and all that. I mean, there's multiple reasons as to why these texts wouldn't have survived. It doesn't necessarily take some outside force destroying everything, or even the Christians themselves specifically destroying particular documents that would have erased this mythicist-leaning group. It's just how shit works. And now we're going to move on to something a bit hypocritical that Dr. Kipp lays out as being something that he would need from the mythicist evidence in order to accept the plausibility that there was no Jesus at the start of Christianity and that it was purely a mythical thing that was only read out of Old Testament scriptures.
I'll say at the start too, one of the other real issues here is that when you go back to your earliest text, certainly, you can't really find any clearly mythicist texts or traditions. And also what else is very strange is that if mythicism was something that was suppressed in the first century and replaced with this historicized Jesus, the other thing that's missing is any indication or counter testimony to this from early Christian writers. It seems it would seem very strange that this was, the start of this movement and that it just entirely disappeared and we have no evidence for it at all within just, a few decades, a century.
Now, this seems to be, by Kipp's own admission, nearly impossible in order to convince him that the mythical Jesus is plausible. As we saw before, Kipp admits that we have a whole bunch of information that's just lost to us due to the fall of the temple in 70 CE or so. And we have multiple other things that have complicated our ability to know about this initial first group of Christians that would have been great information information for us to have. As I mentioned before, Christians selectively maintained certain texts that aligned with their own personal theology that they wanted to create and that they wanted to become the standard for Christianity. This was driven by theological needs rather than the need to preserve history. If any mythicist-leaning text would have survived the first century, then the Christian church was sure to cull those and make sure that they were, done away with. They were destroyed or hidden away. This was an attempt to control Christian theology. We see this with the Nag Hammadi library, which was saved from a textual culling in the 4th century. The early Christian church, as it moved towards orthodoxy, often condemned texts that it considered to be heretical. This included Gnostic texts, or what some people identify as Gnostic texts now, but the Gnostic label really doesn't mean a whole lot as we have seen in the literature. But what most people associate with Gnostic texts, and if you don't know what that means, it just simply means people that didn't necessarily think that Jesus was a living person on earth. That wasn't their only belief that was considered heretical, but that was one belief that they held. And these beliefs that they held were in stark contrast to the orthodoxy that the Christian church was trying to establish. Now, all of this background information makes Kipp's requirements quite unreasonable. And as you saw, he already admits the earliest ideas about Jesus were lost and destroyed. So this does seem like a bit of hypocrisy coming from Dr. Kipp here. How are you going to hold the position that all of this information was lost and destroyed and all this, but then at the same time expect us to have some of the most heretical ideas that the Christian church wanted to go away? The only reason why we have things like the Nag Hammadi library is because monks and other Christians that wanted to preserve their history hid them away from the Christian orthodoxy. They wanted to preserve their history, and so they did. This library of texts, along with the Dead Sea Scrolls, gives us a pretty good view of what some of these groups were teaching, and we see a little bit of hints in these texts that the beliefs that were held by not only first century and later Christians, but also a wide variety of Jewish beliefs that were going around prior to Christianity. These were varied, and sometimes they starkly contrasted against what we know about the mainstream versions of each of those belief systems. Essentially, Kipp's position is unfalsifiable. He's basically expecting us to find information that he knows doesn't exist anymore. Next, we're going to talk about the original context of scriptures. Is the original reading of the text important, or is how later Christians and later Jews reinterpreted these scriptures to be about certain things? Is that important, or is it a mix of the two? Let's hear from Dr. Kipp Davis.
Within Judaism, to understand that this could potentially refer to a single celestial figure, a son of God who suffered and who was crowned as the king of the universe. So
does he just not know the difference between singular and plural nouns in Greek?
I assume that's got to be it.
So basically in this clip, what we have is Dapper Dinosaur and Dr. Kipp Davis scolding Dr. Carrier for apparently not being able to read the original text and also not understanding what the original text originally meant. Of course, Dr. Kipp either doesn't know or he is willfully uninforming people that this text, the Wisdom of Solomon, exists in multiple forms. One of those forms uses the plurals in the spot that he has a problem with, and the other versions use singular. Another thing that he's not adding here is how Pesherim work, and he's not clearly explaining his understanding of Pesherim logic. So it's very clear right here that the original intent of the Wisdom of Solomon and what was originally written and all that is the thing that matters, instead of the actual argument in that these Christians were reinterpreting the scripture in order to be about their supposed Messiah. So we're not talking about the original intent of the text. We are talking about the reinterpretation of scripture. That is going to be very important for this second part, which is the hypocrisy in it all. Next, we're going to hear from Dr. Kipp and Dapper Dinosaur what they feel their role as historians, because Dapper Dinosaur does have a degree in history, just like Kipp Davis has a degree degree in biblical studies, they're going to be explaining what their role in this is, as far as interpretations and original context and all that.
Like, what good would it be if you only thought of it in terms of, well, what good would it be devotionally if the only way you thought about it was in terms of its original context? Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't think about it in terms of its original context. It's absolutely imperative to think about any text in terms of its original context. But also, you need to think about text in terms of what does it mean for you right now. That's kind of the point of reading. If all we cared about was the original context, then, I mean, there might be a few people like me or, you that would be interested still because we're interested in history just for its own sake. But for the most part, people wouldn't care about text generally, not just the Bible, but like.
True. Yeah.
I mean,
yes, I am first and foremost interested in what the texts mean in their original context, but it doesn't stop there. Right.
Right.
A part of my job is to understand how these texts came to be developed and transmitted and interpreted over time.
Now, the first thing that I want to do is emphasize that understanding the original context is very important when you're looking to understand these types of religious texts. And this is especially true for Christianity. You can use this in order to identify sources that were used to construct the theology of Christianity. But more importantly, this arises when it comes to refuting certain claims that Christian apologists make, like Jesus fulfilled all these prophecies. It's very important for you to denote that the original intent of the prophecies or the text wasn't to predict something that Jesus would do. It's just that later Jews and Jewish Christians reinterpreted this text to be about the Messiah. And as far as the Gospels go, they fabricated information so that their Messiah would fulfill all these perceived prophecies. That's how working the original context into an argument against Christianity would work. It's also why it's really important to understand the original context. But like I said, one of the important traditions to emphasize here is the use of Pesherim logic and the creation of Pesherim in general. This was a Jewish interpretive technique for their scriptures. This method was not only respected, but was also practiced in the first century, including Philo, who applied Pesherim logic throughout his writings. In this particular context, it concerns the unnamed archangel, Philo's Logos, in which he performed Pesherim logic on the scriptures in order to illuminate information about this archangel. However, in this live stream, Dr. Kipp provides misleading information about the Pesherim. He claims that Peshers were only created to explain contemporary events, but he neglects to point out that Pesherim were also used in order to explain near future events, mostly of the eschatological nature. That would be speaking about the end times or what they expected about the end times. The predictive aspect is part of what scholars like Dapper Dinosaur and Dr. Kipp Davis recognize as interpretive uses of scripture, an area they both agree is crucial in their discussions. Interestingly, when faced with viewpoints that differ from their own, Dapper Dinosaur and Dr. Kipp Davis seem to overlook these interpretive practices. This selective approach conflicts with their acknowledged importance of scriptural interpretation in understanding these biblical texts, particularly in the context of mythicism and New Testament studies. All right, next we're going to move on to Kipp and his position on Jesus's existence, because on the one hand, he says one thing, but on another hand, he says something that's completely contradictory. My point in Nothing, the publication of JSHJ by Brill, was meant to show that this is a mainstream, non-confessional, non-religiously motivated academic publication. That is all. And I have not once promoted a position of certitude in the existence of Jesus. In this stream, I was deliberate about noting the possibility that there was no Jesus. I will repeat here what I said in the video. The critical problems with arriving at a view of a purely mythical Christ are connecting these to Christian origins out of early Judaism. As soon as someone manages to convincingly show this connection, it is an idea that remains unhelpful to serious historical explorations of the question. So far, no one in the field has been convinced. So as you'll notice in this comment, Kipp has stated that he has put forward no certitude about Jesus's historicity. But is that what actually happened in the live stream? Well, I feel like he said something at least once that contradicts this statement and should make us question whether or not he's sincere about the possibility of Jesus being a mythical person.
As I mentioned, one of the things that mythicists must contend with are these statements by Paul which appear to clearly indicate that Jesus was a human being. So we can only be as certain as the sources allow us to be. And in this case, yeah, Paul is our earliest source for Jesus, for early Christianity. And there are a handful of really important key texts that indicate very clearly that he understood Jesus to have lived and died on earth. In Galatians chapter 1, very importantly, in verses 18 to 19, Paul tells us that he met with and spoke to Jesus's actual brother James. Here, it's one of the very, very difficult things to account for without positing that there was an actual Jesus who actually lived and died on earth is the presence of a brother, an actual brother that Paul met and spoke to.
For $10 says, James having such authority and being singled out in 1 Corinthians 15:7 by Paul makes the best sense if he was simply Jesus' brother. If not, he was just another Christian brother. Why not include him in verse 6?
See, this is problematic, right?
From a position of somebody that's trying to learn what he can from two scholars in this field, I find Kipp's statements here raises a lot of doubts about his honesty. On the one hand, he believes Paul solidly places Jesus as a historical, earthly person. Yet, on the other hand, Kipp is suggesting that he's leaving the possibility open that Jesus was nothing more than a mythical, non-earthly figure. These two positions are inconsistent, because Kipp's position isn't simply that you can interpret Paul's words to mean an earthly figure. He was pretty solid about what Paul is saying and how Paul considers Jesus to be a historical person. Why else would Kipp point out that Paul knew Jesus's brother James? Of course, Kipp isn't considering the possibility that some fuck could just be claiming to be Jesus's brother, or that people thought this dude was just Jesus's brother and not Jesus's actual brother. He's not leaving room for that. That would be the way that he could fix his position so that it's not so contradictory. But alas, Kipp doesn't say that in this segment or in the entire live stream. This particular contradiction and hypocrisy is quite easy to solve. That's one way that he could solve it, or he could just pick which pot he wants to shit in. He can either hold the position that Paul clearly places Jesus on earth as a historical figure, or he can say that it's possible this Jesus didn't exist. What he can't do is hold both of these positions simultaneously. It's one or the other, or the one caveat that I mentioned before. Personally, after looking over all of Paul's theology, as well as the Greek words that are used, their uses in literature, how Paul uses those words, I remain unconvinced that Paul definitely thought of James as his blood relative. The wording that's used here and all of the surrounding information concerning what Paul thought about God's family, I feel casts enough doubt to label it as way too vague in order to come to any kind of concrete conclusion. So I'm holding to the possibility that both options are available to us, that Jesus could have been a historical figure and that this James could have literally been Jesus's brother. But I also hold to the possibility that Jesus didn't exist and this is a fictive kinship relation. And also I think that, while people could have thought this James was Jesus's brother, they could have been mistaken, or James could have been bullshitting people. There's a lot of wiggle room in this particular idea, but what we can't say is that one explanation is far more likely than the others. I'm personally convinced of one explanation because I think it makes far more sense of the information. As far as being certain about Paul's mention here, I don't think that we can be certain. But of course, Kipp is certain, but also leaves open the possibility which are mutually exclusive in this particular situation. Well, heathens, that's going to be it for me today. I hope that you enjoyed these contradictions and hypocrisies that I pointed out in the live stream that Kipp Davis did with Dapper Dino. I feel like everything that Kipp says at this point has to be questioned, and you have to critically evaluate everything that he says and every position that he holds. Now, I feel like this is really bad for a scholar because I feel like scholars should be trusted to give you good information. But when you go through an entire live stream and you contradict yourself so much and you provide so many opportunities for hypocrisies to pop up like they did in this live stream, I feel like maybe you need to reevaluate the shit that you're saying, and maybe you need to carefully choose your words a little bit more. I've heard that scholars in Kipp's position have to be very careful about what they say about this particular topic area. So maybe Kipp can put a little bit more thought into it next time. But anyways, if you will, please go down below and let me know what you thought about these 4 points that I brought up. Do you feel like they actually are hypocritical portions of the live stream, or do you think that I'm just mistaken and I'm building a mountain out of a molehill here? Let me know what you think down below. And while you're down there, why don't you smash that like button and subscribe if you like content like this. Don't forget to stand up and use your voice. Bye, heathens.